Hi guys. So I have to thank those of you who responded to my request a few days ago on a post of mine where I told you about this book, The Best Asian Short Stories, which has recently uh, come to my hands because it actually was published in 2021, but due to the pandemic, I couldn't get hold of my copy, which was really frustrating. So I'm sure you can imagine how excited I am to have it in hand now. Now, the short story in this book is called Saving Grace. And like another of my recently published short stories, Losing Bindu, this has a very particular place in my heart. So, and I'm shortly going to explain to you why. So, on the post that I recently put out about this, I gave you guys three options and I asked you which of the options you'd prefer. The first was for me to tell you about the rather unusual backstory of Saving Grace, how I came to write it. The second was to tell you about a slightly weird experience I had while writing this story. And the third was to read an excerpt from it. Now, some of you very kindly and very cleverly said that you would like an option D, which was all of the above, but I didn't want to make this reel any longer than it needs to be. So I'm going to go with option A for a start, and then if we have time for option B for now. And one of the reasons for this is that this is actually quite a complex story, so it is a difficult one for me to read you an excerpt from. I need a little bit of time to figure it out. Anyway, Saving Grace is actually the result of an experiment that a group of writer friends and I did some years ago, where we decided that we would write a story that one of us would start the first chapter, somebody else would do the second chapter, and so on. And at least for us, it was a completely new idea. The idea itself, I'm sure, has been done before because there's nothing new under the sun. But for us, it was new. And the main theme was that basically we would look at the previous chapters that had been written, not only the immediately previous chapter, but any of the previous chapters, and choose a minor character from another chapter, which we would then tell the story of. I was one of the last people to hand in my story, so the character that I chose was a minor character that appears in the first chapter of our little experiment. And the idea was that we could write about anything we wanted because we were never going to publish that series. So I think Saving Grace might actually be one of the first stories from that work that has actually been published, but there were a number of really brilliant stories there. So I hope that I will see some of them in other forms, in short story forms elsewhere. And the character that I chose was basically one of the cleaners, two young women who are part of the cleaning crew. And the backstory to this was that the story is set in a fictional country in the Middle East at a 5-star hotel, and it's kind of what happens behind the scenes. And so the character that I created for this was called Benny. He's a man from the Philippines. There are 3 protagonists here, really, but the story is told in the voice of 2 of them. So Benny is a man from the Philippines, and then there is another woman from the Philippines called Grace, who is the Grace in the title of Saving Grace. And Amanti is from Sri Lanka, and she is the 3rd person in this story. And the story is written from the viewpoint of Benny, the first half, and the second half is written from Amanti's viewpoint. So it was a really unusual way to get to a story, in a way, but I'm really glad that it worked out, and I'm really glad that this story was published. And, the Best Asian Short Stories is quite an exciting place to have a story in. So I feel very honored and very grateful that this story made it there. So that's the backstory of how it came to be written. And the second element of the options that I offered you was what was the weird part of writing this story. And I have to say, I have heard many people say to me that, sometimes the characters take on a life of their own and, they take over the story. To be perfectly honest, I was kind of cynical about this because I was just thinking that how I am the writer, they are my characters. How can they possibly take on a life of their own to the extent that they're doing things I don't want them to do, or I hadn't planned for them to do, rather. But that's exactly what happened with this story. So Benny, when I conceived of him, was basically kind of a nice guy, very straightforward, young man from the Philippines, and he is the manager of the cleaning crew. And Amanti and Grace are both members of that cleaning crew, but he's the manager, he's their boss, basically. And to me, Benny was like a nice guy, straightforward character, as I said. But the really weird thing is, somewhere in the middle of that story, it actually did take a turn in a very strange direction. And Benny turned out to be far more complicated and less of a nice guy than I had intended him to be. And anyway, the story got written. I was initially thinking, like, where is this going? Because there were certain key elements that remained from my original story outline, but the rest of it kind of went off in some very different directions. And then after I'd finished the story, I shared it with my writing group, and one of my friends there, Laurie, said, "Oh my God, I didn't know you had a story like this in you." And it's kind of funny because I didn't know I had a story like this in me. So I'll be very interested to know what those of you who read this story and have read some of my other work actually make of it. It's a darker story than some of what I've written. And of course, the protagonists are all foreigners. Bangladesh features in a very tangential way, but it is tangential. So that's how how the story came to be written. What was very strange about that writing process, and I have also a group of really wonderful beta readers who are familiar with my work, and they get my work, and they're brilliant about their critiques, the feedback I'm given. And so even if there's something that they didn't like or something that they question, it's much easier for me to understand where they're coming from. And probably at least 50% of the time, 50 to 80% of the time, I will take the advice if it makes sense to me. So what happened with Saving Grace was that my beta reader, Adiba, read it, and she said, well, this is kind of a unusual story, but what would have been really interesting would be if part of the story was told in the voice of one of the women. And I was like, oh, you must be kidding. This story is finished. I'm not doing more on this. And she said, no, I'm not telling you to actually rewrite the story. I'm just saying, but wouldn't it be interesting? So anyway, I then spend the next 4 or 5 days just really resolutely trying to ignore what she had said. And then, of course, I had to come back to it. And in the end, the second half of the story got told from Amanti's point of view. So my beta readers have quite an important impact on my stories, and I'm really, really grateful to have them. So now, as I said, the excerpt I'm going to leave for next time, because I have to figure out how to give you an excerpt without, this story is very... I don't really even know what to say. It's difficult to draw an excerpt from that will be coherent. So I have to actually think about this before I can do that. Anyway, I hope you will enjoy the reel. I hope you have a wonderful evening. And if this reel cuts off after 1 minute, please go to YouTube, because for sure the whole reel will be there. I'm hoping maybe even Instagram will finally relent and allow me to have the entire reel here, but I don't want to make any assumptions. And just to let you know, Bookworm Bangladesh and I are trying to get in copies of the Best Asian Short Stories. It's published in Singapore, the 2020 edition. And I hope then it will be available to some of you to read. Thanks for listening, and have a great remainder of your night. Bye for now.